Good morning to you. It is good to see you here. Good morning. Thank you, Bob. Good morning. In the way of announcements, I guess I have a couple announcements I can make. Some of you already know this, but last night about 10:30 or 11, Cindy's mom passed. And so tonight's Faith, Food, and Fellowship is just going to be a food and fellowship. So it'll be a time to gather together at Shirley's house and have a good time together. But Cindy is leaving for Mississippi this afternoon to be with her sisters. So that happened last night. Glad that Becky is at peace, I'll be honest. So they asked me, Cindy and Cindy's sister asked me to do the funeral next week. So they said the last thing they want is somebody who doesn't know her to try and make her a saint. I can take care of that. So,
are you taking cooking?
That's right. Now I've got to balance that fine line between eulogy and roast. That's going to be the line I'm going to try to walk.
Can you fill in for Cindy tonight?
What can I fill in for Cindy? I could never do as well as Cindy can do. No, that's her. That's her evaluation. That is her. I can't do that. But we absolutely are going to have that conversation again. I was talking to Meg that we need to reschedule that because that's a valuable lesson for all of us as a church to learn how to provide pastoral care in difficult times. Yeah, she's great at it, and I'm your shadow. What's that?
And you're not?
I'm not great at it. I can do it, and I feel like I can do it pretty well. But you have to understand, I'm minor league compared to her. She's a pro. So someone asked how she was doing. This morning, I think Shug asked how she was doing this morning. I said, well, she's doing pretty well. Like her pastoral care and bereavement is something that she's exceptional at. So she has names for how she's feeling. She understands exactly what she's going through in many ways. So,
yeah, but it's not the same when it's
It's not. No, we've talked about that several times. That how she's able to be a chaplain everywhere, but then in her own family, she falls right back into the baby of the family instead of being the chaplain, which is fun. But yeah, so that will probably be next weekend that we will have that service. So. But that's what I've got in the way of announcements. We were talking about Psalm 95. I know that on the schedule it originally had said Psalm 101, but I just couldn't give up Psalm 95. I must have made that list and forgot that I didn't have Psalm 95 because I really do enjoy talking about Psalm 95. What's that? You came for Psalm 101? They're going to leave now. And I got to say, points to Liz for actually buying a copy of my dissertation. That's dozens of copies sold all around the world, and she purchased it and then she complained about the words I used. So
Are you gonna sign it?
But I did already. She made me sign it. Yeah. So my wife hasn't even read the dissertation, so I can't believe that someone else did it. She read the acknowledgments because I mentioned her in them. So, but anyway, but just as a reminder, as a where we are now. Whoop, can't keep the things going. There we go. We're in book 4 still. Book 4 is obviously a book that's near and dear to my heart, as I wrote a book on it. But it is in that it's the part of the hymn book that came together when Israel is trying to find answers, when they are trying to make sense of a world that's no longer making sense. The things that they always counted on, we saw last week in Psalm 89, things that we always counted on, that God's covenant would be forever, that David's son would always sit on the throne, that we would always have the land, that this very identity-forming beliefs that Israel had came to an end in 587. When Jerusalem is destroyed, they're taken off into Babylonian captivity. There is no king of David, son of David sitting on the throne as king anymore. It shook them to their core. It was an identity shaking, that dark night of the soul that many of you, I know, have probably had in your life at a time or two. Something has happened that has caused those questions to come or has shaken identity. In many ways, book 4 is Israel trying to answer that question. It's the part of the hymn book that gets added on after Psalm 89 finishes with, where are you, God? What is going on? What is happening here? And as I suggested last week, Psalm 90, and I would argue the rest of book 4, focus on Torah, focus on Moses, and focus on God as king. instead of David as king. Last week we talked about how much importance they had placed on human kingship, and how much importance they had placed on Jerusalem always being there, and always being able to count on Davidic covenant. They were just sure that would never pass away. And then it did. And so now, where do you go? Where do you turn? Well, you go to ancient authorities. You go to an older voice that can speak. And Moses is the one who speaks. And so book 4 is very much a Moses book. It is a book that emphasizes, we'll see Moses today in Psalm 95 as we go through that. But we're turning back and turning our attention to God as king. One more thing I wanted to point out. Biblical scholars like to talk about what the center of things are. I don't know why we do that. What's the center? What's the most important point? What's the most important thing? What's the one thing we need to, and of course, since they're scholars, they don't agree on what that is. And there have really been sort of two major foci of what the center of the Hebrew Bible is. Probably for the majority of the 20th century, covenant was what they felt was the center. That everything in the Hebrew Bible somehow related around covenant, whether it was Abrahamic covenant or Davidic covenant or Sinaitic covenant, with Moses. That the idea was that God has provided covenant with God's people, and that the people have failed to do that, and they need to get back into covenant with God. But that's sort of, for them, that you can see all of the Old Testament sort of revolving around that. In the probably late 60s, early 70s, a new school of thought came and said creation is actually the center of Hebrew Bible. In other words, God as creator, God creates, humanity comes along and corrupts what God has created, and then God has to come in and recreate all over again. And that series, that cycle happens all throughout Scripture, from Genesis 1 all the way through, that God creates, humanity corrupts, and God has to recreate again. And then humanity corrupts, and then God recreates. It goes on and on and on. The last one is an interesting one because neither covenant nor creation really explains prophetic speech really well. We're going to talk about prophets this fall, because I love talking about prophets. But the prophets sort of bring together covenant and creation in a way that kind of makes them unique and sort of new in and of themselves. That they do focus on the covenant and the breaking of the covenant, what God has done in the covenant, but they also focus on creation, and they use both of those things as an effort to encourage a lifestyle change, a way in which humanity needs to live. And so prophetic speech is a little bit different sort of center of the Old Testament, but you do see it throughout the text as well. I mentioned these three today, not to have you pick a side in this, but because Psalm 95 is fascinating because it brings all three of these elements together in a really interesting way. This little brief psalm actually has elements of covenant in it, has elements of creation in it, and it has some prophetic speech in it as we go. Okay? So, saying that, we're getting ready to start. Any questions or concerns before we get going? Okay. Psalm 95, untitled. Most of the psalms in book 4 are untitled. We don't have a lot of, we get the Psalm of Moses at the beginning and for the Sabbath day, but most of the untitled psalms here. So probably a little bit later compositions. Verse 1. Come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation. Let us come into his presence with thanksgiving. Let us make a joyful noise to him with songs of praise. For the Lord is a great God and a great King above all gods. In his hand are the depths of the earth, the heights of the mountains are his also. The sea is his, for he made it, and the dry land which his hands have formed. Come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker, for he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand. Oh, that today you would listen to his voice. Do not harden your hearts as at Meribah, as on the day at Massa in the wilderness, when your ancestors tested me and put me to the proof, though they had seen my work. For 40 years I loathed that generation and said, they are a people whose hearts go astray, and they do not regard my ways. Therefore, in my anger I swore, they shall not enter my rest. And that's the end of that song. They shall not enter my rest, is the last word that we get. So, well, before I start talking, let me take a minute and ask you, what do you see there that you find interesting?
The last line, they shall not enter my rest.
Yes.
I've heard that the concept in Jewish theology of an afterlife began to develop at this time,
Correct.
not before.
Correct.
They had no concept.
Yes.
Is that true?
Yes, yeah, that he was noting that it is generally believed that it was really the exile that began to develop a sophisticated notion of an afterlife in Jewish thought. It's hard to talk about heaven or hell or anything like that in the Old Testament, period, but absolutely before the exile, it's really hard to talk about that. I will say that in Jewish thought, particularly, you see it in the New Testament in Hebrews explicitly, that rest, Sabbath, was very much eternity. I mean, the goal is, heaven is an eternal Sabbath of God's rest with God's people. And so it is that I think we're seeing the makings of that here. Absolutely, that concept.
The word rest
Yeah.
suggests that.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's possible to think it that way. Yeah, sure.
I see a switch at the beginning, they're talking about the Lord, and then it switches and it's God talking.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one thing.
Yeah, we were talking, and what's funny is Psalm 94, you know, I'm a canonical guy, so I like looking at the Psalms before and after these Psalms as they're coming together. That's interesting to me, and sort of shapes the way we read the Psalms. Psalm 94 is a psalm in which the psalmist is calling God to judge the nations for their wickedness. That God, you need to judge the nations. And then you go right from judging the nations into let's bow before the Lord and worship. And then God's response is, y'all get it together. You need to get it together. Don't be like the folks who didn't have it together. Even though they saw my works, and they still couldn't get it together. So yeah, you don't get a lot of God's direct speech in the Psalms. Most of the Psalms are humanity's words to God. But every now and then, God pops in with a word. And this is one. Other things you see? Yeah.
Yeah, I have one question is, the first one in this war has came out, the living things, so what kind of stuff? That was created by Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
The first things, what kind of shape was it?
Oh, sheep?
Shape, yeah.
Yeah, zone is the word.
Hebrew
we
is
talked
what,
about that.
Hebrew create to shape was. The first things in,
Created.
what kind of stuff is here in developing in the world?
I'm
Before
not
going
getting the
into
question, I'm sorry. Can anyone else help?
Before born,
shaping?
human being in here, in the world.
Say it again, Betsy.
Yeah, the world is first born in developing what kind of stuff in here, world. That time's no more arose human being. First develop living things. Yeah, first born is living things. Yeah, living things in the world. What kind of stuff? That was Hebrew create that it.
That the firstborn was the one who inherits?
Yeah, firstborn, what kind of shape was for living things?
What kind of shape for living things?
I'm not sure I'm
What's the
answering.
question?
Yeah.
That's how living things are developing is the firstborn in the world, before born in the beginning.
Right.
The Hebrew Bible don't might be Hebrew about these things also.
Well, that's in Genesis, if that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, the notions of primogeniture are, you normally find that in Genesis. And those items.
Well, that's one of also, and including also in this firstborn in there is showing the third folio. The firstborn in the
We'll
world.
have to talk about this later, because I'm not quite getting it, I'm sorry. I
I
apologize. I've only got one good ear anyway, I'm sorry.
The son of.
A few weeks you talked about choir groups going off on whatever. This one is like that too, because there's a number of hymns
Mhm.
that are based on like verses 1 through 7.
Right, right.
And, you know, I hate to admit that I don't study the Psalms at night, but I never realized we had 8 through 11
Psalm
afterwards.
95,
I
yeah.
thought 95 was just like,
Just one
sing a
thing.
joyful
Sure,
song.
Sure. Well, and luckily the Psalter will help you with this as well, because I know some of you may have as a favorite hymn Psalm 100, and you might have heard some echoes here, and that's because verses 6 and 7 are exactly the same as Psalm 100. They just use those verses and that one is all happy. Psalm 100 is. So we can just focus on the happy one there. But you're exactly right. I mean, I've seen it's amazing to me, because, you know, when you start studying something, then you see, like when you buy a new car, you suddenly see everybody driving that car, you know? When I was doing my dissertation on book 4, book 4 Psalms are everywhere. I mean, they're all over. It's like the favorite Psalms people quote. We've got a book 4 Psalm on the hallway, up, you know, on leading to the choir lot on the education wing. We've got a book 4 Psalms all over the sanctuary right now, 104, 95. I mean, these are great Psalms that all are celebrating God's power. But yeah, there's also these parts that we don't talk about in church as much. So hey, get it together.
Is there possibly another word than the word loathed in verse 10?
You know, I thought I might need to check on that, and I didn't. But if you'll bear with me, we can open my Hebrew Bible and I'll look. Will that be all right?
Yeah, I don't know.
Let me find. We're in 95, right?
Now, the other book, Bible that I use that has footnotes only commented on the fact that the I there might possibly also be referring to just the leaders of the church, not necessarily that it's God.
Does the test make you feel any better? Probably not. Probably the test bereaved? No, bereaved.
What did you say? What was the first word you said?
Detest. Yeah. Yeah, well, that's not going to help us a whole
We
lot.
did
is
not
it?
make him happy.
Yeah, I would guess.
The NIV just says I was angry.
Oh, well, there we go. That's,
No, it's,
That's
that's
how
in the
it's
next
always-
verse.
yeah, well, that's true. Where's that?
Therefore, in my anger, yeah, 11.
Got tired. I like verse 10 says, for 40 years I got tired of you. I like that. That's actually kind of nice. It's that growing concern. Yeah. At Mirabah and Massa? Does anyone remember Mirabah and Massa? Place of testing and both those are the two sites where they had just crossed over on dry land. They had just seen the waters part, and they had no water. And they started complaining about having no water and no food. And so God sent the quail, and then God told Moses to hit the rock, and everything was better. And then in the book of Numbers, same thing happened. No water. And this time God told Moses, just go talk to the rock, and the water will come out. And I think Moses, a little afraid because his authority was being challenged, that wasn't quite showy enough. And he also, trying new things. We've never done it that way before. And so he decided to hit the rock like he did in the last book. And it worked. He had to hit it twice because it's hard to get the same results if you just keep doing the same thing over and over again. And so the water flowed, but as a result of that act of disobedience, Moses was not allowed to go to the promised land. So that is actually a remembrance of Moses' failure and the people's failure in that context. And a reminder, I think, that's the thing, God seems incredulous in the book of Numbers and Exodus, both of them, that the people are disobedient when they've seen what God was doing, right? They crossed over the sea on dry land, and then they're worried they don't have food. You know what? You walked across on dry land, you think I can't get you food? I mean, is that what's going on? I mean, God really does seem a little incredulous at that. But yeah, this is a reminder and an invoking of that Numbers section. By the way, one thing that I just find fascinating, Hosea, the book of Hosea is probably one of the most passionate, I won't say probably, Hosea is the most passionate picture you see of God in the entire Bible. Most of the time, all we focus on in Hosea is the Gomer part, verses chapters 1 through 3. But chapters 4 through 14 are all God speaking, and God is on an emotional roller coaster of dealing with a bad relationship. It is highs and lows, and one of those elements is longing for happier times. And in the book of Hosea, and in Jeremiah also, God says, things were just so good in the wilderness. You relied on me, and you trusted me, and things were just don't know how it went so bad when things were so good. And I always ask the students, do you just want to ask God, did you not read the book of Numbers at any point, God? I mean, really? Longing for happier times? But he does. The text actually has God longing for happier times, and he thinks of the wilderness as that, which is fascinating when you read Numbers. But this is a Numbers and Exodus reminder. of that act of disobedience, where I tend to read it as very negative, but I guess depending on the day, God can have a more positive view of it. Couple of translation issues that are worth mentioning. O come, in both of those O come, that's a little more, I don't know, passive is the right word. It is actually the imperative for walking. So several of my friends, one of my that wrote a commentary, she liked move it as a translation for that, as opposed to come. Move it, let's worship the Lord is a much better, there is much stronger urgency than we can make come. That seems a little soft. The Hebrew is much more, let's go already, we're worshiping, come on. So that's there. Also, listen, that you would listen to his voice. That is another invoking of the word Shema here. So we talked about that several times. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord alone, Deuteronomy 6:4. That's another place where that word occurs. So no question in my mind invoking that call to Torah, call to God's worship there as well. So that's another translation we get. Other thoughts that you have? Yeah.
Sort of a general question. I've
Sure.
read that at this time in exile, when they were trying to sort of crystallize their own thinking about themselves, that they drew on some ideas from Zoroastrianism,
Yes.
for worshiping what was going on all around them.
Okay. I'm going to have to say this in a way that will be received correctly. I always have to say this in a way that's correct.
Must be necessary they did.
It is, no. No, I don't want to be stoned as a heretic. Let me put it this way. It is at the very minimum curious that after Israel spends time in exile, they begin talking in terms of angels and demons in exactly the same way that this other Persian religion was talking about angels and demons as well. I am not saying they got the idea of angels and demons from Zoroastrianism. I am saying that it could very well be the case that, yes, Zoroastrianism had an influence on the language they used when they talked about worship. You can believe God revealed the truth of them through Zoroastrianism if you want, or you can say it's just a remarkable coincidence that after hanging out with these people, they started talking like these people. We do see a very favorable portrayal of Zoroastrians in the Bible as they brought gifts to the Christ child in Matthew. The Magi was the name of the Zoroastrian astrologer. And so we three Zoroastrians is really what we should sing. This is not very popular. Hard to get a rhyme with Zoroastrian.
One of their main beliefs was an afterlife.
They did believe in an afterlife. They did believe in an ethical monotheism. Ahura Mazda was their great god. They believed that God had 7 Holy Spirits that proceeded, that we should take care of the poor and lift up the widow. And I mean, I have no problem imagining that as the Jews are sitting in exile meeting these people going, wow, there's a lot of resonance here. And so some people have suggested that one of the apocryphal books, Tobit, some of you, if you grew up Catholic, you may have heard the book of Tobit, that Tobit might actually be the story of Judaism told using Zoroastrian imagery. In the same way that remember your 8th grade English teacher when they taught you Beowulf, and they said that Beowulf might actually be using Christian imagery, but you're using mythology of Northern Europe to talk about the Christian story, that they may be using the mythology of Zoroastrianism to talk about the Jewish story in Tobit, which is why, we're going chasing a rabbit here, but this is why there's a dog in Tobit that is portrayed very positively. Dogs usually in Jewish tradition, in the Old Testament in particular, were wild and not thought of very positively. However, in Tobit, there's a very friendly dog who comes running, who, by the way, there's a dog in the panel at the Sistine Chapel, on the Tobit panel, there's a dog in it. The reason that this is significant is because Zoroastrianism believed that dogs were wholly good animals. They believed that in all this world, there are things that work for good and there are things that work for evil, and that exists on a spiritual realm and a material realm and everything else. So that dogs are wholly good animals, serpents, wholly evil animals, cats, a little bit of both, depends.
That's right.
That is
That's
actually
right.
a canonical, I promise you, it's a Zoroastrian belief. Cats, could go either way. So, but anyway, that I think did shape a little bit of the way they talked about afterlife. I think there's no question about that. Yeah. I'm not troubled by that. It troubles my students enough. they can murmur when I talk about that. But I don't think it's any cost to it. Jim's really worried about what happens in the afterlife today, so we're gonna.
As long as there's cats.
As long as there's a cat. Depends on the cat, right? So, I love all that. Anyway. I talked about the three ideas coming together in this psalm, and I think you can sort of see some of them. We are as God, the people of his pasture, and a great king. Both of those ideas are invoking a lot of covenant imagery, that God is the one in charge. God is the one who is their sheep, king and shepherd are images we saw in Psalm 23, very common, and talk about relational ideas. And so there is some covenant imagery there. Hard to miss the creation imagery though, right? The hands of the depths of the earth, the heights of the mountains are his. One thing that is fascinating that we probably jumped right past is in verse 5. The sea is his, for he made it. That is incredibly controversial. I mean, that would be a countercultural and shocking idea in ancient Judaism, because the sea was chaos. The sea was that primordial chaos dragon, that evil that exists, that God shaped and brought order to. I mean, we tend to jump right to creation from nothing, but most of Jewish tradition didn't think in terms of creation from nothing. They thought in terms of God bringing order to the chaos dragon. And you can call that chaos dragon Rahab, like we saw last week. You can call it Leviathan, like you see in Job and in other Psalms. But the chaos, the sea, was that seas are terrifying. Water is terrifying. Water will kill you. The Phoenicians seem to be the only ancient Near Eastern group that didn't get scared of the ocean. Everybody else, you go out in the ocean, you're going to die out there. You know, it's terrifying out there. And so to say that God made the sea is, we're seeing some movement here toward that monotheism that I was talking about happening in the exile, where all of a sudden it's not that there are other gods, but in fact there is only one God, and it is actually God who is the one who's responsible for the exile. And the reason that God is responsible for the exile is because we didn't get our act together. So let's make sure and get our act together and keep this from happening. So that little phrase, the sea is also his, the sea was before he made it, that would have really caused a theological introspection on behalf of an ancient Jewish reader. To take a moment to think about chaos, the difficulty which seems to break out every now and then, ultimately being in the hands of God also. That's a radical idea in the psalm that I think sometimes we're missing.
I wonder if they would have still had that if they had been able to conceive of the oceans that make the Mediterranean Sea
Oh,
look
yeah.
like a little puddle.
Yeah, maybe. Well, except that, I don't know, that might have reinforced it, because the oceans are terrifying. Yeah,
They can be.
yeah, when you get out, it's like I said, for some reason the Phoenicians are the only group that really enjoyed them. Everywhere else was terrifying. I mean, in Babylon, the creation story is the evil, watery chaos dragon. She is the saltwater dragon who's going to destroy everything that Marduk has to beat back. I mean, it's always terrifying. And so to have the sea created by God, I think just to take that moment is significant. Other things you see. I wonder about. Yeah.
It's not exactly something I see, it's something I kind of don't want. I read about, before coming here, about Hebrews, and how Hebrews uses this, as, I may have read it wrong, as a way of, putting pressure on Jewish people to believe in Christ, so Hebrews is not my favorite.
She was talking about that Hebrews, by the way, Hebrews uses a lot of Psalms, and Psalm 95 is, book 4 Psalms are very popular. My colleague at Judson is one of the world's experts on Hebrews, and so we talk a lot about, book 4 Psalms and how they're used. Of course, I'm interested in how they're used here, and he's interested in how they're used there, and so we didn't have a whole lot to talk about. But that you're exactly right, that the end of this psalm is used in Hebrews as a proselytizing motivation toward non-Christians at that point. Yeah. But, I mean, on some levels, that's the beginnings of faith for all of us. I mean, that most of us we'll start out in life loving ourselves. And, you know, infants are like that. They don't care if you just went to sleep, they want to eat. They don't care if you just put on a clean shirt, they need to throw up. Right? I mean, it's all about them all the time. And it needs to be that way. But at some point, the next stage of faith is that learning to love God for self, which is, I want to go to heaven, I don't want to go to hell, I want blessings here, whatever it might be. But the next stage of faith after that is a stage we see in Job, or a stage we see in, I think, Jeremiah, or even Abraham in the offering of Isaac, and that is to love God for who God is, apart from what we get out of it or us. And so I guess what I'm saying is, when I potty trained my children, I bribed them or threatened them to make it work, hoping that eventually they would learn to go to the bathroom in the toilet for the sake of going to the bathroom as well. I wouldn't always have to give them a cookie or sit in the sad chair when they eat. And so on one level, I'm troubled as you are. On another level, I think sometimes you have to start out in faith somewhere. And so, while I would not use the scripture that way, I understand people using the scripture that way. I guess it's probably the best way I can say it.
The Hebrew word for salvation here,
Mm-hmm.
would that be the same word that Jesus used when he offered his particular kind of salvation?
I'm not 100% sure. I think that might actually be the same name for Jesus' name.
Ah,
Yeah. Salvation. Yep. You might, I just about said you might notice. I was about to try and say, look at the Hebrew. Everyone will see what it's seeing. That's something. Sorry about that. That is Yishanu. Yishanu. In other words, Jesus.
Which,
That word,
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of that.
The first part of that question is, he was asking a question about salvation and what that word meant. Did that relate to Jesus' word for salvation? And I pointed out that's actually Jesus' name. Is salvation or deliverance. Yeshua. Moshe. Yeah. And so, yeah, that's actually, so I think, yes, directly connected to the nature of who Jesus is. Because it's his name. So, yeah. But I think it's amazing to me to see Rock of Salvation and Massa and Meribah in the same psalm, right? Because the water came from the rock in Massa and Meribah. And to call God Rock of Salvation, I think we're absolutely invoking that early Exodus story and reminding what disobedience does and calls to faith and that sort of thing. So for me, you know, the payoff in Psalm 95 is great. And now we can pick some really nice verses from Psalm 95 and other places in Book 4 if we need to. But it really is, as a psalm, bringing a lot of ideas together. A call to worship God. Let's move it and let's go and worship the Lord. In the midst of, you know, asking God for judgment on the people that got us into this terrible situation. But before waiting for an answer, rushing to worship God. Let us all go and worship God right now. It's important. We need to do this. And remembering the deliverances that have come before, I think is important. And recognizing that it is God who is the ultimate authority. And we're going to talk about this in the sermon in a little bit, that this notion of other authority figures that demand our attention and that sometimes themselves can take on roles of authority that they shouldn't have, and places they shouldn't have in our life. Like even Davidic covenant, something that in and of itself was not bad, but came itself to be an idol in the mind of ancient Israel, that became, oh, God will never let anything happen to us. But remembering ultimately that God is the authority figure, that God is the king, the great king above all gods. God is above all and over all and demanding that. So, and this call for us to obedience, this call for us to live a life worthy of God. And remember the workings and the miracles, the wonders that God has done. And reminding us of the call for us then, again, to sing and go. I do love that the psalm doesn't end with any resolution or any happy ending, or we don't know really this story is. Don't be like that. Thank you. That's it. The psalm ends. And there's an expectation. Jewish texts love cliffhangers. The Old Testament loves cliffhangers. There's never resolution in anything. I mean, Abraham gets this great promise in Genesis, and at the end of Genesis, he's got 70 people. He's told to be a great nation and get the land. And then at the end of Deuteronomy, Moses' last speech, You know, the big St. Crispin's Day speech, you know, they may take our lives but not our freedom. Let's go get the and then the book of Deuteronomy ends. We don't have them taking the land. There's a cliffhanger there. Second Chronicles ends with Jehoiachin released from prison. Is he going to establish a new kingship? Is David's line going to continue? We don't know. It happens. There's always a sense of expectation. Same thing going on 95. Don't be like that. There's a sense of, I don't know, it just invites you into the life, I think, of faith when you do that. Originally, Mark ended with a cliffhanger. Mark 16. Mark 16:8 was the original last verse of the book of Mark, which was, the angel said, you know, go to Galilee, tell the disciples and Peter everything that's happened, he'll meet you there. And the last verse was, and the women were terrified, didn't tell anybody anything. That was the last verse. And it was a way of calling that early church to, so what are you going to do with this testimony? Well, the women didn't do it. What are you going to do with this testimony that you have now heard? And so it's a great tool, I think, rhetorically, to draw you in, to just end like this, like the psalm does. It's great, great song. What other thoughts you have? Yeah.
It's a minor point.
Sure.
You keep saying Jerusalem fell in 587. Everybody else says it fell in 586. Is there any significance at all?
No.
I mean, it was a process.
It was, and I learned it one way, and other people learned it another way, and so it's like saying St. Augustine or St. Augustine. It depends on what your professor did, and you tend to rebel against that. You go the other way. But,
There's a lot of people.
yeah.
That they went in the stages.
They did. There were several takings. We have better date for 598, 597, the first deportation, because the Babylonians dated that to an eclipse, which is very nice when they do that kind of thing. But later on, 587, 586. I tend to use both of them. I think I say 597. I think it's 586 is the better number. I'm not too. As Paul says, don't get caught up on the days of the week or days. That's my excuse. Good. Any other thoughts before we go? All right, let you go a little early this week, so we get the choir. So, thank you for your good attention and good attendance. And we will do Psalm 119 next week. I won't read all of it. Okay, otherwise we won't have time.
Do we have to read all of it?
You should. Great. Go ahead, Mark.
Only Mark.
Some people came in late. Would you announce?
Oh yeah, real quick, just as for those of you who came in late, Cindy's mother passed last night. And so she is on her way to, she's going to be on her way to the city this afternoon. Tonight's Faith, Food, and Fellowship will be a food and fellowship. And we'll get together and eat together. But we will reschedule her pastoral care instruction for a later time because it's a valuable lesson. And she needs a chance to share that. And we need a chance to learn it. So there you go. Thank you so much. What's that?
Hey, Babu, how are you? I'll see you later.
You're still on camera. Yeah, you're still on camera.
So how have you been this? I have missed it.
And we came out to
That is outstanding.
all 6 yes. After it, because I was so sick of my daughter, maybe we should start with
She